Hey, familiar faces.
Hi, Chris.
Hey, Eric, I meant to be here earlier. I think I used the wrong link. I was
Oh,
sitting
no
in a.
problem. An empty room. No problem.
Oh, wow. This is fun. Dan, is that your house I've never seen? It must be.
Yes, I'm in the office. Hi.
Ah, one of these days.
Yeah, you have to come visit Jersey.
Yeah. And hey, John. And hey, Shell.
Hello, Chris.
Shell! Ah! Oh, and there's the Radigan. Oh my God.
Hey,
Wowza.
Hello. Nice to see you, Dan.
Give it a few minutes. People are joining in. Hello, everyone.
Natasha! This is Old Home Week. I don't have any like song and dance prepared for this quietness.
Everyone.
Natasha, how are you doing? I haven't seen you in about 40 years.
40?
You're muted, actually.
I am good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. I forget where you are exactly.
Near Chicago.
Okay. There's a deposit of Yellow Springs people there.
Yeah, we seem to have like deposits in the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest, all the good places.
Yeah, Portland, Seattle, Chicago. A few more of us up here in Vermont now.
Nice.
Yeah. I miss seeing your sister on Facebook. She left a long time ago, but she was a fun presence.
Oh, thank you. I'll let her know you said that. Thanks.
Hey, Pat.
There I am. Okay.
Jean! Oh my gosh, I didn't even like pick up on the fact that you were here. Hi.
Almost late.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
I know, how many years?
Summer of 80, no, the fall or spring of
No.
85.
Yep, 85.
Wow.
In London, right?
Yes, and yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, how funny.
Okay, let's get going here. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We're so excited to have you with us, and especially to have Chris Tebbetts here joining us to discuss First Case. My name is Erica Nichols-Fraser. I'm the Communications Manager at the Children's Literacy Foundation. I'm going to just briefly introduce the work we do, and then I'll turn it over to Chris, and then we can open it up to discussion. So please mute yourself if you're not speaking at the moment. Please feel free to put questions in the chat, or when it comes time for that, you can raise your hand. I'll do my best to get to you in a timely manner. So first, just to introduce Cliff, the Children's Literacy Foundation, we like to call ourselves Cliff. Our mission is to inspire a love of reading and writing for low-income, at-risk, and rural kids, ages 12 and under in Vermont and New Hampshire. So one of the ways we do that is we send Vermont and New Hampshire authors like Chris out to programs where kids are, spaces where kids are gathering, to get them excited about reading and writing, and to give them free books. So we haven't been able to go visit kids this year, but Chris has been one of our wonderful presenters who joined us for a virtual story time. You can find that on our website and our YouTube channel, his presentation. So that's been exciting. But we're still giving lots of books to kids. We're still, going at it. So we appreciate everyone being here and joining us this evening. I did just want to announce as well that our next book club in April will be on April 23rd with Poet Veranda Porch for Poetry National Poetry Month. We'll be doing a Poetry Without Tears evening. So more of that will be coming on Cliff's blog soon. So if you want to learn more about that, do sign up for Cliff's blog on our website to get that in your email. Next, I want to introduce our wonderful author here, Chris Tebbetts. So in addition to First Case, which I hope most of you have read, Chris Tebbetts is the author and co-author of many books for young readers. Those include the #1 New York Times best-selling middle school series, also with James Patterson, as well as the best-selling Stranded series with Jeff Probst from TV's Survivor. Chris is also the author of 2 YA novels, Me, Myself, and Him, as well as M or F with Lisa Papadimitriou. I hope I pronounced that somewhat correctly. His work has received Children's Choice Awards in Oregon and Hawaii, as well as a Sunshine State Young Readers Award nomination, and a nod on the New York Public Library's annual list of books for the teen age. He offers author talks and writing workshops for any age from 4th grade through adult, online and, when feasible, in person. Chris has visited schools around the country and taught for the Antioch Writers Workshop, Highlights Foundation, Adirondack Center for Writing, and others. Find him online at christebbetts.com and at Chris Tebbetts. And with that, Chris, I will have you take it away.
All right. Thanks, Erica. Nice to be here. Thanks for what you guys do. It's a little intimidating to know that the last person to sit in this seat was Dan Brown, as in Da Vinci Code Dan Brown, but I'll do what I can. So they asked me to just sort of say a little bit about this project and my relationship to this project before we open it up for just general discussion and Q&A. And a lot of you know me, so a lot of you already know that my career has been a little bit unusual as compared to a lot of my other writer friends. I come from a filmmaking background in college and a theater background in my 20s before I eventually got into publishing. And that may or may not have something to do with the fact that the writing I've done has been so collaboration heavy. I think of filmmaking, I think of theater as collaborative storytelling. And I really, through a series of coincidences more than anything, I stumbled into one co-authoring gig after another when I was a newbie in publishing, and it became this sort of professional niche for me out of convenience and then out of desire. I've really, really enjoyed all this collaboration. I think my motivations are a little bit different than, I've always said I consider myself as much of a craftsman as an artist when it comes to writing. I'm really motivated by the idea of storytelling, whether it's my idea or somebody else's, more than I feel like I'm coming to the table with things to say with my stories. I like to find out what they're going to say as I'm writing them, as a lot of writers do. But it's got that sort of added angle of working with another author quite often on the ideas that they first bring to the table. So in terms of First Case, I have it sort of blurred out. That this was and wasn't a new experience for me. I mean, it wasn't in terms of collaborating. I've been working with Jim Patterson for quite a while now, primarily on middle grade fiction, as I think a lot of you know. And then I also do have some experience with adult titles, although all of those have been ghostwriting, another form of collaboration. And so this was the first time. It was new in that this was the first time I was sort of taking ownership and having my name on the cover of an adult title. So it was a new sort of exciting adventure for me, but also familiar at the same time. And when I thought today about, what is it that if my motivations aren't the traditional ones that might drive a lot of authors to write their stories, what is it about this collaboration and specifically this project that appealed to me? What is it that I got out of the project? And I thought of three things. One being, as I already at least imply when I talk about the different kinds of work I've done. One being is that I really like variety. I like professional variety. I've always said that I admire and aspire to be one of the chameleons as opposed to one of the specialists. And because a lot of my thinking goes through movie terms, I think of people like Meryl Streep and I think of Sean Penn and people who can sort of bring something different to every project and who can make every project different in some way. I really like that. I like that challenge and I like that variety. And it also sort of circles back to my theater days. When I was much younger, I thought I wanted to be an actor. As it turned out, I am not much of an actor. I'm a pretty lousy actor. But it allows me this variety, this coming to all these different projects with all these different kinds of characters and writing for different audiences. It all requires me, as true for a lot of writers, it requires me to think at least in some terms, like an actor, to put myself inside their experience. So I get a little bit of that experience as a writer, and I like playing different roles, as it were, including this character, Angela Hoot, a woman who, on paper is nothing like me. But on the other hand, by the time I was finished working on my draft of this story, Angela had some of my sense of humor. The reason she rides a mountain bike is because I had a new mountain bike when I was working on this story. The reason she and Eve like going to Lucky Chang's is because when I went to Boston and I was researching this book, somebody said, go to Lucky Chang's, and I thought it was great and delicious. So into the book it goes. She's also 19. She's a young genius, again, as a lot of you probably know. So there's almost a crossover YA appeal to this book. I would say any young person who is, okay with watching an R-rated movie is probably okay with this book. So again, it's sort of me injecting the story with more and more of my own self or experience or background. And she's also on a learning curve. I love writing characters who are on a learning curve, especially if I'm on a learning curve of my own. This whole cyber forensics thing was new to me, so it's a lot. I find it a lot easier and in some ways more fun to sort of bring my experience to her experience, a little bit of the wide-eyed learning as we go together through the story. So that's the variety piece. I mentioned that there are 3 things that really grab me on this project. The other one is just research itself. I love being thrown into a new topic. And again, because I'm coming to other people's ideas, working on other people's ideas for these collaborations, I never really know what I'm going to be researching until I get thrown into the project. And in some ways, it almost doesn't matter. I just love the learning curve itself. Unexpected topics that I might not naturally find interesting or might not naturally find a reason to look into or learn about that I'm then required to learn about. And the analogy for me there is always, when I was a kid, how I never wanted to get in the bathtub. And then once I was in the bathtub, I never wanted to get out of the bathtub. That's me in research. Like once I get into it, I love doing it and I don't want to stop. And then sometimes it becomes a problem because that's all I want to do is just keep researching and researching. And you accumulate this mountain of information you're never going to be able to use in the book. But I just enjoy the process so much. And what was I going to say about that? Research, bathtub. So for this book, brought me some new experiences I never foresaw for myself. I was in Boston at the FBI field office, interviewing their young interns, getting to see their cyber forensic unit, getting some real firsthand experience. In some ways, it surprised me. I have been really surprised over and over at how accessible people will make themselves when it comes to doing research. I never really expected that they'd let me into the field office, much less this locked cybersecurity unit that looks a lot like the one in the book. So I was really pleased and really loved getting to do that. I was equally surprised when I hit up the media contact at the Metropolitan Police Department in DC, but with the knowledge of homicide and homicide investigations, I ended up having an ongoing relationship with the chief of homicide there, who was more than willing, as a lot of people are, I find, more than willing to talk about what they do. People like to talk about what they do. I took a cyber forensics course on a website called Cybrary. That was actually kind of one of the more boring pieces of my research, but I learned a ton. Constantly reading about current events, reading books, reading interviews, even looking at things like Boston real estate listings. Eve's townhouse is just taken straight off of Zillow, I think. I found something in the neighborhood where I wanted her to live and just used that as my reference point. And I hit up Boston Friends, of course, for insight on what it is to live in Boston, what it is to go to MIT. Where is there a tunnel that I could use where I could send her on her bike through this tunnel, that sort of thing. And one of the other things that, the last thing I really, really love about research that was initially counterintuitive to me is the way in which research writes story. I think some people get a little reluctant to adopt ideas if they don't come from inside their own brain. I don't have that reluctance at all. If I'm doing research and I come across a news piece or a little factoid or whatever it might be, I very happily just fold those right into story. So if I'm feeling stuck in the writing, for instance, I'll go back to research and I'll go looking for articles, and they really can help jumpstart my imagination or my plot even, just based on the ripped from the headlines kind of thing, adopting over real events into my fictional scenarios. And then the third thing that comes to mind, which I don't like as much as research or variety, but that I've pushed myself into and has been rewarding in the past several years, is saying yes to opportunities and experiences because they scare me. So when I heard about the idea for this story, they say write the one that scares you, and this scared me because it felt like a very steep learning curve, nothing I'd ever really done before. And whether it's been speaking gigs or these new writing gigs, I have gotten more and more willing and learned more and more about the rewards of saying yes to things because they scare me. And I, in fact, did love writing this book more than I expected to. But what goes hand in hand with that is I also really love the companionship, sort of coming full circle here. I love the companionship of collaboration. And as a stereotypically introverted writer, I especially love the companionship of a high-profile collaborator like Jim Patterson, where I don't have to do the marketing. The real luxury of having my name, being the second banana and having my name small on the cover is that I get to stay home and write, and I don't really have to get out in the world and sell these books. And in an industry that's really populated by introverts, I know that a lot of people can appreciate the luxury that represents for me. It's not a trade-off that a lot of people, that everybody I know would want to make, but it's worked out really well for me. And that brings up the question of the co-writing process. I usually get a lot of questions about that, but maybe I'll stop there. And if you want to know about that, we can talk about that as well. So I don't have to keep going blah, blah, blah here right now.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for that, Chris. Wow, you answered a lot of my questions already, but we appreciate that. And everyone, feel free to put a question in the chat if you have a question for Chris, or you can raise your hand and I will do my best to get to you. Oh, I see a raised hand here. One moment. Jana, go ahead.
Hey, Jana.
Hi, Chris. Nice to meet you virtually. So I'm Erica's colleague at Cliff. And yeah, actually, one of my questions was about the co-writing process. So if you had something else you wanted to sort of say about that, I'm always really fascinated to hear about how people put a story together with more than one person.
Yeah, it's like I said before, I really just stumbled into one co-authoring experience after another. And first, the first was with Jim Patterson, so it wasn't anything I was at all inclined to say no to. Even though I'd never done anything like that before. But each one has been different. Working with Jim, he has more ideas than he's ever going to get to in the world. He owns that fully. He's also been around the block enough times that first drafting is not his favorite thing to do. So what he does is he comes up with a detailed chapter by chapter outline. For a book like this, it might be a 40-page document. And then I read that. Sometimes he'll ask me to rewrite the outline from the get-go. Other times it's more about, as you dive in and as you start peeling this onion, if you find things that don't work, go ahead and fix them. And if he doesn't like that, then we'll find something else to do. But I send chapters into him once a month. A book like this will be over the course of about 10 months. He'll read my chapters. We'll get on the phone. We'll talk about how the story's going, changes he might want to make, that sort of thing. And then when the whole draft is finished, he'll then rewrite it to his satisfaction before it comes out maybe a year later. So one of the unusual parts of this for me is I send off my finished draft. I may have done the 10-month thing. I may have done another rewrite depending on where we are and what he wants from me. And then I don't see it again until the book comes out. So that can be a bit unusual to then start looking through and find new things or find things missing that I had in there before. But working with other people, again, James Patterson is the 2,000-pound gorilla in the publishing industry. So I always say I work for Jim. He has full veto power over the story in that regard. Whereas when I worked on Stranded with Jeff, for instance, he had a TV and film storytelling background, but not a book writing background. So we brought more mutually to the table. And we spent a lot more time really crafting the characters and the plot and the scenario up front, at which point I wrote a whole first draft that we then got together and hashed out together. And then lastly, on my YA novel, MRF with Lisa Papadimitriou, that was two characters telling the same story from two different perspectives. So we played writer tennis, where I wrote chapter 1 in my character's perspective, sent it off to her. She wrote chapter 2 in her character's perspective, and it went back and forth. And that was a real direct collaboration where neither of us had veto power over the other, although we had ownership of our characters.
Wonderful. We have a few questions here in the chat, and then I see a raised hand as well. So first question is, how did you come up with the crime, the way the clues would unfold, and the way the perpetrators would stay a step ahead so believably?
Did you say that's in the chat? Because Your
Yes.
sound, I don't see in the chat, your sound dropped out. I didn't hear all of that.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's in a direct message to me. So how did you come up with the crime, the ways the clues would unfold, and the ways the perpetrators would stay a step ahead so believably?
That's a big part of where research can write story. I mean, I had the outline that I was working from, but I mean, that in particular is the most, oniony part of the onion. One of the things I love about mysteries is they are puzzles, and that means you have to create a puzzle, and then you have to solve the puzzle as you're writing it. So a lot of that was about discovery on the page. I knew that there was this app. I knew that it was going to, entice users into these dangerous situations. But other than that, I hadn't yet, when I saw that outline, I hadn't yet learned the ins and outs of embedded code and, all kinds of things. I wish I still had that vocabulary at the front of my brain. I wrote this about 2 years ago, so some of that vocabulary is gone. But it really was about discovery along the way, and using the outline as a guidepost, but then sort of trying to synthesize everything I learned along the way to inform the situation as I was writing it.
And so
It was
similar-
app-based. It was
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that there's another question. What was
I'm
the
sorry?
inspiration for the app? What was the inspiration for the app?
This is where I run into, I'm not entirely sure because again, that's an idea that originated with Jim and then was handed to me, but it certainly is in the zeitgeist. Last summer, a good friend of mine wrote a YA novel that was about a killer app. And so we did, a couple of events together. I think it's, it's certainly on people's minds. It's on, it's in the zeitgeist, the risks we take by going online. I mean, that's not a new story, but it feels like rich material in any case.
And Wendy, I see you have a question. Go ahead.
Hi, Chris. I have a couple questions. I'll start. It's interesting. One came up as you were talking, in terms of the distance between when you've written the material and then when it comes out. And I imagine it's also similar for people, like you said, in movies, right? They filmed it a long time ago, and then they're out doing the promotional tour, and how that feels for you for that distance, and then revisiting it all again.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because this is exacerbated by the fact that I don't do a lot of promotion for these books. So that last question, when she was asking about how did I just, figure out how these crimes were going to unfold, part of me was going, wait, how do those crimes unfold? Like trying to sort of recreate the plot in my head. And I'm even remembering now that, for instance, we have the poet and the engineer. I didn't realize that there were going to be two different roles until I really started writing this story. I started to realize that I was actually putting two voices into the messages that these characters were getting. And that sort of just happened organically. And then, yeah, I mean, sometimes I'll go back and reread the material as the publication date comes closer. And I'm sorry, can you remind me of the first part of your question?
No, I think that's it. It's like reconciling that just the difference of timing and what you have to do in once it does get released and comes out. And so you answered. I mean, you have to refamiliarize yourself perhaps a little with the story, because I imagine you're working on all this other stuff right now, right? You have other stuff that you're working on
Yeah, that's right. When I first started working with Jim, I would say, to him like, oh, do you mean for this to be like such and such in a previous book of yours? And he was like, I don't know. Like, you just can't hold on to all of the plots, especially somebody like him with that many books. And there was something else you reminded me of. It's gone.
Well, Dan has a question.
I'll hold back. I have a second question, but I'll let others go. So
We'll go to Dan, then Wendy. Maybe we'll come back.
Oh, that's what I was going to say.
Go ahead, Chris.
There was something that Wendy reminded me of, which is this is particularly difficult in writing for young readers for me, which is that publishing literally or technology moves faster than publishing itself. So the book you wrote a year and a half ago about that app or about that technology or about the impossibility of cracking that code, there's no guarantee that that's going to be true when the book actually comes out. You have to proceed a little bit gingerly in that way. And you also have to ask your readers to do a certain amount of understanding in that regard. Jim likes to really work with very contemporary things, including, current movies that have come out. The characters often read books that are, you know, current at the time of the writing, that sort of thing. And I try to like use the absolute newest stuff, and then it's just a roll of the dice, especially when it comes to technology because it changes so fast.
Sure. Dan, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So I was in a bit of a panic because I got the book like 3 days ago and I'm a really slow reader and I didn't pick it up until this morning and I flew through it. I really loved the book. I haven't read this type of book in a long time and I thought you hit it out of the park, Chris. I
Thanks.
really loved it. My question is, I'd forgotten in this sort of thing, in Patterson in particular, I mean, I call them Patterson books. I mean, I'm sure it's true. Is I want to ask you about the brevity of the chapters because I was really impressed with the economy of words. I mean, it's almost poetic how much you managed to get across in so few words. And I'm wondering, is that because, I'm just wondering in the process, when you're writing this type of book, do you find that when you write the chapters, you let them fall onto the page in your own natural cadence and then cut them back to size? Because you're obviously very aware of the need for the pacing. Or have you gotten to the point where you're so good at this type of writing that from the get-go, you're sculpting something very precisely? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes to both. I've gotten better at it over time. I think part of the reason I've been able to work so well with Jim for so long is that I came to the table with a certain amount of, you know, I call it fat-free writing. I like to write as spare as possible, or, you know, in Einstein's terms, as simple as possible, but no simpler. The short chapters you mentioned, and oh gosh, I keep forgetting what I was going to say. But yeah, one thing that I've really, really learned from him over and over again is what can be the less intuitive part of writing for me, which is what does not belong on the page. And every writer is going to have a different definition of what does not belong, but his definition is so spare, and there have been big things that he's asked me to take out that I think, oh, we can't possibly do without that. And then, in fact, we can. I think that's part of the addictive quality of his books. I think it speaks to his success, his commercial success. And it also, there is definitely a winnowing process. I mean, to the first part of your question, the first drafts are always, yeah, for sure, going to be much longer. And I think I don't remember if it was Voltaire or somebody who has a famous quote about, sorry to write such a long letter. If I'd had more time, I would have written a shorter one. Because that kind of cutting takes time and effort. And really getting it down to when you're so enmeshed in the middle of the story, trying to figure out what the reader's going to need to know, what you've already said in very subtle and insidious ways. Repetitions can be very hard to pick out sometimes, or very easy to miss. But I have gotten better at that over time. And he's really, really pushed me to get to really get it, down and down and down. This book is short by adult mystery standards. It's 60,000 words. I think I handed in a 50,000 word manuscript at that point. I was sort of had reached this apex with him of cut, and it was just too short to sell. And so they literally asked me they said, do you want to add some plot points, or do you want to go through and figure out how to put 10,000 more words in here? So this is actually what you read is the long version of the book.
When you made it longer, did you lay in more plot points, or did you choose to expand on certain elements of the story?
I really went like at the sentence level, and I just found lots and lots and lots of ways, sometimes a paragraph, but quite often it was a sentence or a half a sentence all throughout. And I did start to see with this was, a few months after I'd finished, and sometimes that's all you need to get some perspective on a project. You can lose perspective when you're so buried in it. Yeah. And I was able to start to see, oh, I could give more information here. I could give more information here.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Was Angela his idea? It's a new character, right?
It is, yeah. And Angela, the original Angela Hoot, the woman whose name he used, was a patient liaison for him when Jim went in for some surgery, and he was so taken with her kindness that he wanted to name a character after her. So she has nothing to do with cyber forensics. She's a patient liaison in, I don't even know where, in a New York hospital somewhere. But that name came from him and from her.
Wow. I love her. I think I'm going to read. Are there more Angela Hoot books coming? Is she going to be a series?
I don't know yet. That's up in the air. He gave me the choice of writing another children's book or second case, and I opted for the children's book. I will say honestly, like when I've given the option of my heart work, which is children's books, and thinking about murder every day, I decided to go take a break and go for the kids book. But now that I am in the middle of that kids book, I miss Angela, and I'm hoping he has not found somebody else to write second case. But I honestly don't know. He does those sequential titles, the Women's Murder Club and some of the others. I just have to think that first case is, it's titled that for a very specific reason. Although for a long time it was called The Sexed Murders, which is a terrible title. That's why we didn't use that one. And before that it was called Brilliant Lies.
I'm wondering if you could
Thank
speak
you.
a little more to Angela's character and what it was like to write from the perspective of a 19-year-old woman in this, position that I assume you have not been in this role that she was in. So I'm wondering if you could speak at all to that experience.
Yeah, I found her surprisingly relatable for me, or maybe not so surprisingly relatable to me. My husband, who's here on the call, he and I were just talking the other night. I'm much more attracted to female characters than I am to male characters, whether it's a movie. I'm the guy, I don't like movies that are filled with men who all dress alike, like cowboys and gangsters and businessmen. I tend to like female characters. I related to Angela well. I also put a lot of myself into her. And I'm used to writing young characters as well. So yeah, she was pretty easy for me. I mean, I can sort of slog away at a book, but it's not until I find the voice, either the narrative consciousness or the actual voice. If it's a first person narration, it's not until I find that voice that I can really settle into writing in a way that I can feel confident with. And hers came really pretty quickly. I was a fairly academically oriented kid. I was never a computer kid. But I found enough of her to relate to that it felt like it came out fairly easily. And then I love the idea of a genius. It's intimidating to write a genius because it's intimidating to write a character who's smarter than you are, basically. But the flip side of that, and I was going to say this about the research before, is my very first books, the Viking, this kids series called the Viking, had a football thread. The dad was really into football, and I know nothing about football. But I learned just enough that I could sprinkle details throughout. And several people after they read that book said, I didn't know you knew about football. You can give the illusion of knowing a whole lot more than you do just by using, carefully placed details in the right places.
Sure.
For what it's worth, I was impressed by the technology in the book, but I also, I'm not that surprised. I love that you did all that research, but this book, that stuff could have really sunk the material too. I thought you were just telling us enough we knew to understand what was going to happen next.
Oh, good.
I did, because I think, like you mentioned, that one, if there had been an overwhelming amount of technology, it just would have stopped the pacing, I think. I don't know, for what it's worth. I loved Angela too. I thought she was great. I love that she was lesbian for 20 minutes, because aren't we all?
Yeah, no, that brings up an interesting point. I wondered if people had thoughts on Angela's relationships and whether they felt they were satisfying, whether it was relationship with Billy or relationship with AA or with her family. Did anyone have feelings about Angela's relationships and how that helped contribute to the story? Go ahead, Wendy.
Sure, I would say that made it feel very contemporary, actually, because of a lot more, it feels like a lot more fluidity, sexual identity and fluidity so just in terms of keeping it in the now, I felt that was a piece that really helped to do that, Chris.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I have tried to gay up a few of Jim's previous titles, and he's never taken the bait. So I was glad we landed where we did.
Michelle, go ahead.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
So we've talked a lot about this book, but as you're talking about, you're not doing the sequel. But as you were writing it, now that you know you're not doing the sequel, there's so much unfinished business, whether it's the relationship with AA, or I forget the name of the detective, I finished it a while ago, or with her family. Huh?
Billy Keats.
Billy Keats.
Yes, that's right. Right. So have you already formulated, even though you're not writing second case, have you already formulated the next storyline, plot line? I mean, it just begs for a sequel.
I have notes somewhere because Jim and I did talk about what that might be. And again, those are the kinds of things that come from him and not from me. But he, like me, he likes things that have almost a geometry to them. You know, a killer who kills at 10, at the same time every day, or, who's working his way through a family, or, this app. There's a certain symmetry to it. So I do like thinking about that kind of stuff, but and I think he was prepared to give me some options and then let me choose, but we never got far enough to know. And I actually just I just left behind a project this week where I'm not going to be writing this book, but there are enough plot points there that I'm sort of thinking, if second case happens, there's a lot I can use there.
When you were writing, did you want? I know that Jim has ultimate veto power, but did you want the relationship with AA to progress, or the relationship with the detective to progress, or did it go the way you wanted it to go?
Yeah, I liked the indefiniteness of it. I liked the way she sort of took control, but also liked giving up some control with Billy as well as with AA. I didn't have specific ideas about like what might happen on that front later. I know. I hope I'm not giving too much away here. I know Jim is not super interested in having Angela and Billy be a long-term thing.
Oh, you know more about the
That
second.
I know, yeah.
Okay.
Well,
That's
I don't
a
even
good
know
idea.
I know the book. I don't even know if the book exists, but when we were talking about what it might be, he liked the idea of her moving on. I'm just remembering this now. At the very end, my first idea for the second book was that she go to Quantico, that she start to become an actual agent and not an intern, and that she get, sort of a la Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs, that as a Quantico student, she gets sucked into something.
One more question and I'll mute, but is when you did your research and you met with actual interns, were they that young?
I don't know that she, one woman in particular, she was early 20s.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Thanks.
And it's a good gig.
Yeah, I'm wondering for all those readers out there, if you felt you saw parallels between other FBI or law enforcement kind of dramas you've seen, or if there were things in this book that felt different to you than kind of some of those things you might be familiar with. Does anyone have thoughts on that regard and how it kind of fit into the genre, or how it may have been different? And if not, maybe Chris, you can speak to some of your inspiration that you may have drawn upon from some other sources, relating to these kinds of dramas.
I don't read mysteries. It's a little bit of a dirty secret of mine. It's not a genre that I'm particularly enthusiastic. It's funny because I love writing them. I love the puzzle of them. And that can be, I suppose, a blessing and a curse, that I'm not weighed down by, my preconceptions about how they need to go. And I'm trying to think, but by the same token, I'm a movie kid, I'm a TV kid, I'm a pop culture kid. So it's safe to say that everything I write is probably derivative in one way or another. But the counter argument to that might be, whoever it was, Willa Cather, and everybody has their own version of this, but there's only 7 stories in the world to be told. I forget what they all are, but we really are telling a lot of the same stories over and over in different ways. I'm really struck, even just using television as an example, by the endless number of lawyer stories, medical stories, cop stories that people not only want to absorb, but that writers are writing and coming up with new ways to tell. It's stunning.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Do we have any other questions or thoughts at this time? I have some of my own, of course. Go ahead, Wendy.
I do, I'll just do one more. I was really interested in you talking about the research and how you integrated it. And I said that I was reading the book Overstory, which is a fictional book, and going through it. And I have a tendency to go down the rabbit hole. So when looking at something or reading something, then I'm more interested in finding out more about it. So for example, who would, what's that intern like, right? But and that author did the same thing, where I read a piece in it describing a situation in a mining camp, and I found the article. I found actually the news article that they had used to create that story. But what was interesting is what the author did with that story. It wasn't just informational. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, you might have done the research, but it's not just informational. It's, you know, obviously to move the story along, but there's something else that's going on, I think, for the author when they're doing it. And with that, I'm wondering if you could talk about, you know, what that is to take that piece of information or research and explore it in a fictional narrative.
Yeah, I don't know if this directly responds to what you're talking about, but I'm thinking about David Corbett has a book called The Art of Character that I like a lot. And one of the things he talks about speaks to my process a lot, which is he calls it coherent intuition, which is to say you get to know your story, you do your research, you read and you read and you read and you do research and you read your draft and you read your draft until you're no longer doing that very thinky stuff. And it's just processing on a much more intuitive and organic level. And I think at some point I reached some sort of critical mass with the research even, and I'm able to sort of take those and, you know, origami them for my own purposes or come up with new things. There are a couple of things I referred to in the book that are actual events. There was an email that went to the director of the CIA, a phishing scam, and the director of the CIA clicked when he shouldn't have, you know, things that happened that you wouldn't imagine actually really happened in real life. So I borrowed some of those, but I also used those as sort of a springboard to invent other things. And that just happens as moments of spontaneous discovery, more than they happen for me as sort of conscious crafting of, you know, or recrafting of the ideas that I've absorbed. And that's really the sweet spot. I mean, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this idea of flow state, but, you know, that's really the best creative spot you can be where theoretically you're maximizing, this is, so the theory goes, you're maximizing your challenges. I'm writing about something I've never written before, and your skills. You know, I'm pretty good at, say, action. And when you can sort of bring what you do to a new experience and fold those together and do it in a way where you're really just writing without thinking about it. You know, I think about like the best tennis games I've ever had, or people who play, you know, Gene, I know you're a flautist, like when you just lose yourself in the music or whatever it is you might be, anything that's a practice, when you lose yourself in it, there's really no better feeling. And there's no more intuitive space either, for me.
That's great. I'm wondering if you can speak at all to the idea of writing suspense and the surprise you did, and if that is something new or different for you for writing in this way. You know, kind of the pacing of suspense, or sort of, you know, I think each of these chapters left me kind of like, you know, feeling so tense after each of them. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah. And I know, Gail, you had your hand up for a question, so maybe we can get to Gail
sure.
next.
Thank you.
Can I share a screen, actually?
You should be able to, or I can give you.
Are you able to make me a host to share a screen? I was just going to show a thing that I use.
One moment, I'm working on that. Multiple participants. One moment.
Gail, did you want to ask whatever you were going to ask?
Sure, thank you. So I'm a public librarian, and I also don't read a lot of mysteries. I read a lot of young adult and children's books, but I was drawn to this because of you and this opportunity to meet you here. And I ripped through this story. I just loved it. It was so much fun, and I really appreciate it. But I was wondering, you know, a lot of adults, frankly, or some of my patrons don't appreciate the co-author thing with somebody like Patterson. And so I'm wondering maybe I missed this because I came in, I couldn't find my link to get in, but how did you connect? And did you like approach him? Did he approach you? I mean, are you just in the network? Or I want to turn people onto this that might not otherwise pick it up. So this is a really interesting thing for me as a public librarian. Like, this is just cool. I'm just interested in that part. Maybe that will help me turn some people onto it that might not otherwise pick it up like I did, and really, really enjoyed it.
I mean, yeah, I've been doing this for a long time, so I've had a lot of different reactions from people. Some people find it highly intriguing. Other people find it even vaguely this sort of creatively offensive. This idea that somebody is And this is a false assumption about Jim Patterson. I'm here to tell you, he's not a rubber stamper on his books. I send pages off to his assistant. I get comments. I get a phone call back the next day with insightful comments. He is very involved in these projects, and he's really involved every step along the way, for whatever that is worth. But beyond that, you asked how we originally got hooked up together. And I mentioned my very first book, The Viking, which I did through a book packager. And those are companies that come up with ideas and hire writers to write the idea and then sell that package to a publisher. And so because they also act as a kind of clearinghouse for authors, when Jim was getting into children's books, he approached them and said, do you have any people who might be interested in writing some sample chapters based on an idea of mine? And they called me and asked if I was interested in that. And yes, I was. And then from there, he hired me directly to work on the middle school series with him. And the sort of macro answer for that is, when I'm talking to writers and especially aspiring writers, I talk about the difference between, holding everything you do accountable for some level of, integrated or, incremental success in your career, as opposed to just showing up and doing the things you're supposed to be doing by getting out in the world and studying the markets and studying the business and writing and submitting your work as sort of a whole package, so that you can then be in the one right place at the one right time, as opposed to always trying to be in the right place at the right time. So I just really lucked into, my association with him, and then our creative simpatico, our creative compatibility, I think took it from there. I always talk about you need at least 2 of 3 things, which is persistence, luck, and talent. And the one thing there that you can control is persistence, continuing to show up. And again, I really do. I really like the collaboration. It starts to sound like rationalization, but I have had the conversation many times about, Louis Comfort Tiffany or Calvin Klein or Andy Warhol, who all had staffs of people working on things that their names ultimately wouldn't go on to. People do hold literature and books and this kind of pop culture even up to a different standard. Sometimes I think accurately, sometimes I think inaccurately. But it's obviously nothing I have a problem with. But I know what you're talking about. There is some resistance for some people to the idea of it.
And Chris,
well, thank you for that. And I think that's a really cool thing to be able to talk to kids about, that it's okay to, share and collaborate with other people, that, it's not just this groovy artist out there all alone in his little cubbyhole. It can be shared and worked together on. I think that's a really important message to kids.
Yeah, one of the questions I get from kids more than any other is, why is your name so small on the cover? And that's all, that's a chance to talk about the business of publishing and whose name sells more books and that sort of thing, but also to talk about the I talk about creative collaboration in terms of creative compromise, which of course this involves giving up ideas that you might love. But I also talk about creative synthesis, which is to say we come up with something we never would have on our own individually.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Sure. And Erica, you asked about suspense.
If you want to share something, you should be able to go ahead and do it.
Okay, let's see if I can show this. I do a lot because I come from a visual storytelling background. I do a lot of what I call visual outlining. And so this isn't directly talking about suspense. I'm just going to try and get to the one thing. But this is just showing you some of the ways in which I come at my stories. I try to think about and look at my stories in as many different ways as possible, including tapping into my own visual, my own visual inclinations. And for something like suspense and mystery, I do this on a scene by scene or chapter by chapter basis to help track the suspense, the mystery, the questions that are being asked, the questions that are being answered along the way, which is so key to maintaining suspense in a mystery story. So I will literally take the time to use these techniques when I am working on a story. This is the kind of thing that used to feel, when I was new, I used to think I want all my writing time to be with hands on the keyboard writing prose. And now I realize, just like with research, the more work I can do around the story, the more I'm feeding the story. And in some ways, the easier I make my job in the end. So I really just wanted to share that one thing, just sort of show one way of thinking about tracking for suspense. But a friend of mine also has sort of opened my eyes, where you think a lot about suspenseful scenes as being short sentences and quick movement and this and that, reflecting sort of the character's state of mind with the prose on the page. But you can also, sort of mix it up, and you can actually create a lot of suspense by slowing a scene down and making people wait for, or making the character wait for what's about to happen in a way that, that works equally well, but from the opposite tactic. I mentioned Meryl Streep before. Makes me think of the way in The Devil Wears Prada, she talked about how her character, who's incredibly threatening, was going to talk very quietly. And she used, the sort of the opposite of what we might imagine for Miranda Priestley. Sometimes coming at things from the opposite place of where you intuitively imagine can be very interesting and unexpected.
Cool. Very cool.
And then also, I will add to that, like I've gotten pretty good at, when I'm working on a project, I print out pages and take them to bed with me almost every night. And my gut has gotten pretty good. If I'm bored by my pages, somebody else is going to be bored by my pages. So, in some ways, it's this very inexact science where it's like, nope, that's not it, try again. Nope, that's not it, try again. And then I'll take them to bed that third night and I'll be like, oh, I'm interested in this. Okay, I'm getting somewhere. Just on a gut level.
I'm wondering if the experience...
And doing it for a long time also.
Sure, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm wondering if the experience...
Oh, just doing it.
Sorry, go ahead.
Doing it for a long time makes it a lot easier to write a whole scene and being like, nope, this isn't feeding the story, and just, as they say, kill your darlings. The more, zillions of pages I generate in my life, the easier it is to cut zillions of pages.
I was just going to wonder if the process was different for you at all, if you think differently about writing for adults than you do writing for a younger audience.
Not really. I mean, the demands of story are always the same. A good hook at the beginning, a saggy middle, an ending that is, my favorite definition of a good ending is one that is both surprising and inevitable. So the reader goes, oh, I'm surprised, but yes, it couldn't have been anything else. The thing for me that's different between writing for young readers and writing for adults, and one of the things I think makes the kidlit world the nicest place in publishing to be, is that we actually have, I would say, we have a shared responsibility to our reader that people who write for adults don't share. I think for kids, it's incumbent on us to include some sense of hope at the end of the story. And that's not to say that everything has to have a happy ending. The Grapes of Wrath has an unhappy but hopeful ending, for instance. A dying man is being fed at the breast of a lactating woman. At the end of the Grapes of Wrath, that's a very sad image, but it's a measure of hope. And that's actually a book for adults. I'm talking across purposes here. But I do think that the thing that is unique to writing for kids is that we do have some obligation. I think I could write, if I wanted to, I could write a cynical book for adults. I would never write a cynical book for kids.
Because you're not listening to the whole thing.
No. Do folks have other questions here, or should I keep rattling through all of mine?
No, Jake. I mean, you haven't listened to the whole thing.
And so I'm wondering if you could speak at all to your literary community, especially in the strange, year that we've all had. I found myself connecting to other writers, throughout the world, and whether it's your writing community here in Vermont or whom else you're working with, what does a supportive literary community look like for you?
I mean, I think it bears saying that when COVID first happened, and because I didn't have kids who were then home during the day or coming home from college or whatever it might be, my life as a writer, it changed as little as anybody I know. Of course, I wasn't going to conferences anymore. I wasn't going out in the world and interacting with writers, but I'm very accustomed to having a very strong online connection and community with my fellow kidlit people and my fellow creatives and fellow writers. If anything, I think over the course of the year, we have found the learning curve for a lot of us has been, how do you make a school visit more dynamic online? How do we sort of work within and around the limitations that we've now been given? And there's been a huge boon of creativity there, even as, we've also struggled. But, for instance, I went to an online retreat in January, and it was a surprisingly fulfilling experience for the writers who were there. I think we're sort of learning to find our way with this format. And I think it's also maybe fed, having said that, I think it's maybe fed by the fact that people are really hungry for connection. Writing is such a solitary thing to do to begin with. I think that's why conferences can be so gratifying, getting out in the world and seeing people who do what you do, because writers so often work in isolation. But then again, by the same token, we're accustomed to the isolation that we've now been sort of forced into with COVID, and we've gotten very creative about it. But yeah, we've always been good at creating dynamic online communities. I'm sure that's true for some other professions, but it's definitely true for publishing.
Absolutely. Do you folks have other questions for Chris? Don't be shy.
Go ahead, John.
Hi, Chris.
Hey.
So, as you're looking at YA, middle grade work, especially maybe YA, I've been reading a lot more of that lately. And some of the trends, some of the things that you're reading are, I don't want to say horrific. They're very serious topics sometimes frightening topics for younger people. But it also reflects the real world, things that everybody deals with. I guess the question I have is, I haven't really seen it so much in your work, particularly because of the storylines you're working with, but how would you go about sort of talking about, I don't know, issues of maybe gender identification or racial discrimination, those kinds of things, in a way that is sort of transforming, maybe hopeful, as you said, bringing some hope in the end, without at the same time just really being very depressing, as the world seems to be very depressing.
Yeah, I mean, some element of, I think endings become very important there. I think it's also important it can be very tempting to try to be all things to all readers especially with stories like that. And I know I don't have to tell you this, you're an experienced author yourself, but trying, avoiding the idea of creating a character who is anything but him or herself or themselves. And creating as specific an experience as possible. It's through those specifics that we, ironically, I think, or counterintuitively, access the universal for a lot of people by showing them a very specific experience that they can then relate to on some level or another. If I didn't, another way of talking about this actually is Dr. Rusdeen Sims Bishop originated a theory that gets used in the kidlit world a lot, which is about how books can be windows and they can be mirrors, depending on the reader and depending on the writer. So, I may not have experienced what the character has experienced, but I can see, I can be given a window onto that experience, and to be told that in a way that is sensitive enough to bring a young reader along, but also non-condescendingly truthful enough. I mean, I think that's the kind of balance that you're talking about. And then mirrors, showing people a piece of their own experience, is also incredibly important. My YA books, for instance, have gay characters. And for me, my choice there has been to write characters who are what I call incidentally queer, which is to say they've done the heavy lifting of coming out before the book starts. So, there's almost not an aspirational quality, but there's an ease to the sexuality in my queer books. But I would never want that to be the exclusion of, that tackle the very real difficult problems of being young and queer in this world. And I hope that there's room for all of those on the shelf, but I also think I've lost the thread of your question now.
No, you're on. That's fine.
It's really difficult. I mean, one of the things that I did tackle with my funny books has been bullying, for instance. And I think that's actually a really particularly difficult subject for young people, because I don't want my character to go out and beat up the bully. I don't want to necessarily write a revenge narrative, and I don't want to write some pat solution to the bullying problem. Bullying is insidious and difficult, and to tell a reader through my story that, oh, you just need to stand up to them, or oh, you need to not worry about it, that's not going to work. So trying to be really creative and honest at the same time, without, as you said, without leaving them down at the end, it's a really difficult dance. People find ways of doing it over and over again, but it's a really difficult part of the process.
Thanks.
Other questions I'm missing? Well, Chris, you talked at one point about researching and sort of the joy and the love of learning. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that at all in the way that you approach speaking to kids and speaking to young readers, and what kind of your goals are in terms of turning them on to the kind of learning that you enjoy going through when you're writing.
Yeah, I mean, I always talk about research when I'm talking to kids, for sure, especially my sort of general author talk. And the other thing that comes to mind when you ask that question, and the thing I think that people appreciate about me as a speaker with kids, is I try to be as honest as possible. I try to speak as personally as possible without taking that too far, but about giving them my story as an author, as opposed to feeling like I'm showing up with something important to say to them. I find that both off-putting for kids and also easier for me as a speaker. If I'm simply speaking from my truth, there's something genuine about that that I think kids pick up on, and it makes it there's less pressure, and that again, as that stereotypically introverted writer, fifth graders have no idea how scared I am when I get up in front of a class sometimes. They don't have to worry about that, but one of the ways that I find of connecting with them is by making it more personal and also more interactive, asking questions. I've done a lot of focus groups with kids, which are actually educational experiences. I may be asking them, for instance, for my stranded castaway stories, like, what would you do if you were stranded on an island? So that's me, getting information for the story that I'm writing. But it's also making them a part of the process. It's a participatory action. It's getting them. It's making them not just recipients of information, but givers of information. And I think that's very engaging for kids. If I really treat it as a two-way experience. And then the other thing that I try to talk about, where I probably get the least inroads, but the thing that teachers always want you to talk about, because kids never want to do it, is revision. That's another part of my presentations. That's usually the time to eat your vegetables part of the presentation as well. But I do, even there, like when I'm trying to come up, if you can call that a challenging subject, when I'm dealing with a challenging subject, the question for me is, how can I personalize this? And the truth for me is, I used to hate revision just like you hate revision. And now I think it's the most fun part of the process. That's when all the puzzle pieces are on the table and I really can start to pull my story together. And then from there, another challenge in writing or in speaking with kids, and I've actually, back to your earlier question, and in doing these kinds of Zooms, is people tend, especially on Zoom, and also kids who are not feeling performative for you, they tend to look relatively bored when you're speaking. And so it can be a little bit like, oh my God, I'm blowing it. And then the session ends and the kids all crowd around. They're like, that was great. Thanks so much. And so I've learned to just forge ahead, like, try and trust my presentation as much as I can.
Totally.
Which is not to say you're going to reach everybody, but hopefully some kids.
I'm sure that you do. Thank you. We know that you do reach a lot of kids. Do other folks have questions? I'm not seeing any at the moment. Well, Chris, is there anything else that you wanted to share with us before we all go off into our Friday evenings?
Oh my gosh. I'm going to say no. I feel like we covered so much tonight. I hope we spoke enough about the book. Anyway, if there was anything else about the book, yeah.
Would anyone else have any
really
final
appreciate.
questions?
Did you actually travel the route through the tunnel, or you just looked at a map? I was thinking, it's like, what did he? It was so well, it's so descriptive that it's just like, what did you do that trip?
I did not. There's Google Earth is great for that, because you can actually walk, or you can get on the roads that you want to describe. You can actually see the trip that the character is going to take. It's illegal to take bikes in that tunnel. She did it illegally, so I was never going to be able to do that. But Google Earth allowed me to, at least, that's where the Christmas colors, I think I invoked in that scene, that came from a Google Earth image.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, thank you so much. We really appreciate you spending your time with us this evening and sharing part of your process. And it's really fun. Just have wonderful to read the book and wonderful to see you. So it's Wendy. Thank you so much. Michelle, did you have one more question you wanted to sneak in?
That was a clap.
Oh, clap, just a clap. Oh, okay, wonderful. Thank you, Chris. We all really appreciate you spending your evening with us. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We really appreciate it. And do sign up for Cliff's blog if you want to get notification about future events. But have a wonderful Friday evening. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to see so many familiar faces.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Bye.
Thank you. It's great to see you. Love the
You
book.
too. Say hi to your sister
I will. Thank you.
and your parents.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Everybody.
Everybody.